Good afternoon in New York and the Americas. Good evening in Europe, Israel, and Africa. And welcome, whatever time of day or night, for all who are joining us from all corners of the world. I'm Yael Danieli, founder and executive director of the International Center for the Study, Prevention, and Treatment of Multigenerational Legacies of Trauma, ICMGLT for short. Thank you for joining our webinar today. Let me begin by introducing Dr. Eva Hofmanska, our welcomer. Eva is the president of Foundation Sunflowers, former legal expert of the Trust Fund for Victims of the International Criminal Court, with a PhD in law, specializing in labor law. Academic with national and international practical experience, including the Trust Fund for Victims of the ICC in The Hague. She is the president of the executive board of the Foundation Sunflowers, which implements the Project Sunflowers, an international initiative which was created ad hoc just a few days after the Russian invasion of Ukraine started in February 22. Eva, please.
Thank you, Yael, for introducing me. As we are in different time zones, so good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. For those who are hearing the name Project Sunflowers for the first time today, I would like to explain that the project was set up as a private initiative by a few lawyers, just a few days after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began, as Yael said. The aim of the project is to support competent international and national law enforcement authorities, including the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, the International Criminal Court, and national courts that adjudicate international crimes committed in Ukraine, and institutions, including the Trust Fund for Victims of the ICC, that in the future will implement reparation programs for survivors of the war in Ukraine. To do so, the project has launched an app to collect information about evidence of crimes and victims, survivors of the war. The information collected creates a safe database that will be passed on to these authorities and institutions. To be efficient in collecting as much information as possible, the project team has established a network of volunteers in countries where Ukrainians currently reside. I can say proudly that our volunteers cover 19 countries in Europe, including Ukraine, and also North America. Volunteers play a key role in the project, as they are the ones who come into direct contact with those who have witnessed atrocities in Ukraine and suffer harm as a result of the war. Sunflowers volunteers are trained in many aspects before they will contact people affected by the war. For example, they must be able to answer questions such as why we are collecting such information, or whether their personal data will be protected, or whether sharing with us information about crimes they have witnessed or damage they have suffered will result in them being obliged to testify before a prosecutor or a court in the future. But most importantly, from us as the project team, is that we want Sunflower volunteers to be able to listen to testimonies from people who have experienced war. Only on the surface, this task seems easy, but it is not. To say that the stories of those who have experienced war firsthand, suffered from it, are very sad is to say nothing. These stories are full of pain and suffering, extremely dramatic and emotionally very heavy. As a lawyer, I have to see this information as personal sources of evidence that can be used in investigations and then in court proceedings. Therefore, it is important to collect as much information as possible from potential witnesses that will support international and national justice. But it is equally important to do so with respect to the do no harm principle. As the person heading the project from the very beginning, I knew that I had to ensure that volunteers had the best possible multifaceted preparation for this task. I knew that the most difficult thing would be prepare volunteers for dealing with a person who is traumatized by war, respecting the do no harm rule. A friend of mine who I met while working for the Trust Fund for Victims suggested that I should contact Yael Danieli for this purpose, saying that Dr. Danieli has participated in creating all key international law instruments on behalf of victims' rights and optimal care. I did so at the end of August, and Yael responded immediately. And so hours of conversations culminated in signing letters of intent between the International Center for Multigenerational Legacies of Trauma and the Project Sunflowers back in September. And today, the second in a series of webinars on reparative justice that we are jointly organizing takes place. And as much is being done in the world to bring justice to the victims of the war in Ukraine, listening to war stories of ordinary people, including witnesses to the most heinous crimes, is not only an important task for Sunflower volunteers, but for all those who care about reparative justice. Thank you, dear Yael, for my 5 minutes, and back to you.
This, as you heard, this International Center for the Study, Prevention, and Treatment of Multigenerational Legacies of Trauma is indeed held in collaboration with Project Sunflowers. And it is the second in a series following a primarily conceptual introduction to reparative justice. Though I strongly suggest to everyone, if you haven't done it yet, to indeed view our number one in the series. Because here in the first one, we answer its call for specialized training. So the first one was primarily conceptual. Today, we answer the call of that one for specialized training for professionals and others engaging with victim survivors of war's massive trauma to help heal and protect both victim survivors and themselves from re-traumatization. of sharing traumatic experiences. This international, multidimensional, multidisciplinary webinar precedes the teaching training process of potential interviewers about some of the main populations they would collect evidence from or about. These include deported children and their family members, victims of conflictly related sexual violence, torture victims, refugees, prisoners of war, and members of the military. This webinar would not have taken place without the dedicated work of Dr. Irina Frankova, chair of ICMGLT Working Group on Ukraine. And as always, we are grateful to our superb interpreters, Anya Stemkovska and Natalia Zaitz. Your moderator, that is me, am a clinical psychologist, victimologist, and traumatologist, and psychohistorian. I devoted much of my career to studying, treating, and preventing multigenerational impacts of massive trauma, to victims' rights, to rights of future generations, and to reparative justice that views the justice process, not only the outcome, but the moment to moment and the totality of the relationship of the justice system with the victim, as offering opportunities for and is experienced by the victims as healing and repair. Of course, as you will hear from our superb presenters, history and its politicization too plays a role in the victims' and their descendants' experience of justice for their suffering. My version of psychohistory is related as it dedicated to articulating history as it is lived, rather than as mostly a series of dates and events. Our first speaker is Robin Gurvich, professor at Duke University Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the Center for Child and Family Health. Dr. Gurvich is an expert in understanding and supporting children in the aftermath of trauma, including terrorism, crisis, and natural disasters, improving outcomes and increasing resilience. She has been a member of the United States National Child Traumatic Stress Network since its inception in 2001. She is also one of only 22 global trainers in parent-child interaction therapy and co-developer of CARE, that is child-adult relationship enhancement. Our second speaker is Marina Siristia, a teacher at the Department of Military Psychology at the Military Institute Taras Shevchenko National University of Kiev. Marina is a psychotherapist at the Aurora Platform for Survivors of the War-Related Sexual Violence that was initiated by the Ukrainian government and supported by United Nations Population Fund. She specializes in psychological support for people who have suffered from violence, torture, captivity, and difficult family situations. Dr. Irina Frankova is our third speaker, a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Clinical Neuro and Developmental Psychology, Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, and senior researcher at the ARC Centrum 45, the Netherlands, Dr. Frankova is a chair of Traumatic Stress Network, European College of Neuropsychopharmacology, and an assistant professor at the Department of Medical Psychology, Psychosomatic Medicine, and Psychotherapy at Bogomolets National Medical University, Kiev, Ukraine. She is the chair, as I mentioned, of the ICMGLT Ukraine Working Group. Our fourth speaker is David M. Benedict. Dr. Benedict is professor of psychiatry and neuroscience and associate director, Center for the Study of Traumatic Stress of the Uniformed Services University. He is past president of the Society of Uniformed Service Psychiatrists, past representative to the APA Assembly, that's the American Psychiatric Association Assembly, and a distinguished life fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. He retired from the United States Army in 2021, after nearly 34 years of active duty service, including deployments to Bosnia, Croatia, Cuba, Iraq, and Kuwait. Last but not least, we are honored to be joined by Dr. Veronika Plotnikova, head of the Coordination Center for the Support of Victims and Witnesses of the Ukraine Prosecutor General's Office. Dr. Plotnikova had been working in the prosecutor's institution system for over 15 years, leading the specialized units for implementing human rights standards into the prosecutor's office. She co-authored the practical commentary of the Code of Professional Ethics of Prosecutors, is a trainer in the Training Center of Prosecutors of Ukraine, and national expert of projects of Council of Europe. We have 2 hours for this amazingly rich, high-level webinar. Each speaker will talk for about 10 minutes. Following an interchange among us, I will open the floor to question or brief comments from the virtual audience. Panelists will then conclude with last words. Please use the chat function and we'll do our best to respond to as many as we can. Feel free to direct your questions to a particular panelist or to the full panel. Please, for interpretation, please click on the 3 dots on the bottom right of your screen, scroll to interpretation, then choose English or Ukrainian at your preference. I now have the pleasure to offer the screen to a dear colleague, Professor Grovich. Robin, the screen floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I am honored to be here with you. I will try and see. You should be able to see slides, yes?
Yes, very good.
That's always good. That's always good when technology is helping. So yes. I am honored to be with so many of you to talk about listening as we think about interviewing traumatized witnesses and really focusing on children. There is, let's see, there is something about children that scares adults, particularly in the aftermath of horrific events such as disasters, war, terrorism, because we know that children are seeing it through their eyes, and we as adults wish we could wrap our arms around them and keep bad things from happening. So when children are struggling, we struggle. And so adults have this extra layer of worry and concern as we think about how to best help them. And frankly, it scares them. So as we get started, as we think about how to move forward, I think we have to start as we start our work, making sure that we are trauma informed, that we have an appreciation that what we do can impact that survivor, especially that child. So as professionals, we need to take into account what are we bringing in, our own history, personal traumas, our own witness to trauma, our own historical trauma. As Dr. Daniele, her whole organization is on this transmission of the legacy of trauma. As we are talking to survivors, what do we bring in? What is our legacy that we are coming in with? And particularly if our traumas involved something that was similar. And then to think about our own appreciation of world events, cultural, ethnicity, religion, our own history of discrimination. How does that impact what we are getting ready to do? I think we have to consider our values and beliefs related to trauma and our understanding about how trauma impacts survivors. There are special issues when we're thinking about children, and when we think about this horrific war in Ukraine with Russia, how many children that you may be interacting with were abducted and now are returning to their families. What are they bringing in with them? So how do we manage our own emotions as we get ready to have this conversation? Because when we talk to children, they take much of their cues around their responses and what to share or not to share by the adults sitting across from them or beside them. To do that, I think we need to be mindful of our own self-care. How are we doing before we start this work? How are we doing in the midst of the work? And then how do we continue to think about it? Are we being accountable? And I put a quick link. As Dr. Daniele mentioned, I do a lot of work with the U.S. National Child Traumatic Stress Network. And there's a new framework called PRN, based on that medical terminology of take as needed, for a new framework for self-care. I encourage you to take a look at that resource. When we listen to children, I think we need to take in account that one of the most important things as we start any type of relationship, whether it's a therapeutic relationship, whether it is witness preparation, forensic interviewing, getting ready for court testimony, that the child needs to feel safe and secure. And so we need to make sure that as we are talking with them, we are creating a situation that they do feel safe and secure. One of the things that you heard about me is that I helped to develop a program called CARE, Child-Adult Relationship Enhancement. And this is a set of skills. This is not therapy. This is a set of skills of how you can quickly form that safe, secure relationship so you can then do the work that you need to do, whether it's in therapy or whether it's in interviewing, whether it is preparing a witness. This gives a way for you to talk to a child and for you to listen to them. It's very quick. We've actually, I've been very honored to be working with folks in Moldova as they are helping refugees coming across their borders on how can you learn to listen. Something as simple as recognizing what they are doing well, how hard it is, and communicating that to the child or the adolescent. We've done a lot of this training, for example, with forensic interviewers in the United States, so they can better prepare children for their testimony. we need to think about what we know about that child. What are those traumatic stress reactions? And those are going to look different whether you're talking about very young children, preschool children, to school-age children, to adolescents and older teens. So being able to understand what we may see is critical. And when we're talking about, for example, Ukraine, the intersection between trauma and grief is so important to understand. So how do children process grief? What does that look like? And then please keep in mind that there are many children that for one reason or another may have special needs. It may be autism, it may be developmental delays. How do they understand the trauma? How do they understand grief? And how do we take that into account? Because trauma and grief will have an impact on relationships, on behaviors, and the child's ability to learn. And unfortunately, what we often see is without that understanding of trauma, children are often misdiagnosed. They're diagnosed with attention deficit disorder. They're diagnosed with oppositional defiant or conduct disorders, when at the heart of it, we may be seeing trauma and the intersection with grief. Really keeping in mind, as you learned from the first webinar, that sometimes trauma disclosure may not always be the same each time. It may depend on my relationship with you as my interviewer. It may be due to my worries about threats and fears, shame and blame. And for children, I may not have the words. So we often see their relationship to the trauma coming out in behaviors, which is, again, very scary for adults, particularly if those behaviors are defiant and aggression. So we really need to take a step back and form that relationship, thinking about what has that child's experience, what has that teen's experience been in the past with law enforcement, with the court system, with immigration or deportation. I remember in the United States during the pandemic, in one particular state, they said, come to the shelters, we can help you because a disaster is coming. And we will make sure you're taken care of because we will deport you if you come here. We will make sure that we give you 3 meals while we're holding you for deportation. So families were having to struggle. Do we show up to a shelter to protect us from a disaster in the middle of a pandemic when we're being told by the very people that say we'll help you that we're going to take you, separate you from your family, and deport you? I can't even fathom what that must have been like for families. So think ahead, think about the ethical considerations before we ever start this journey. What is our scope of practice? Are we qualified to do this work without making it more harmful and creating a larger legacy of trauma? Thinking about disclosure, helping the child know what to expect. But our job doesn't stop with the child. We need to make sure that the family knows what to expect and what they may see, what they may learn, and to help family and other supports know how to, again, wrap our arms around the child no matter what the age, before and after any type of testimony, any type of narrative that they may need, so that we can best help. Who will be there to advocate for the child? And again, please repeat after me, self-care is essential. If you are doing this work, self-care is essential. We don't want to create a situation where the trauma embeds within us, and then we carry on that legacy of trauma that came to us from outside. So self-care is part of all of that. I know that was really fast, and I'm looking forward to discussing more in depth as we move forward. So with that, I will stop and turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Robin, for saying all the right things. For the for the dialogue phase of the webinar, I would like you to speak a little bit more about abducted children. Okay, so keep it in mind for the dialogue, because that, as you know, this is the particular case in front of Ukraine, in front of the ICC. So, Marina, I'm so excited to give you the floor.
Дякую.
Thank you and good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to be part of the team and to be involved into this very important cause, not only for our country, but globally, because it is so important that perpetrators are brought to justice. That will contribute to healing traumas of not only survivors, but also of the observers, those who observe those traumas. Then, Irina, can you help me with the presentation? Or I can do it.
Is it a technical problem, Marina?
I can help you. If it doesn't work for you, I'll look for your presentation. Yeah, if you could, because for some reason it doesn't work for me.
Or we can go to Irina first and then Marina. Would that help?
No, that's okay. I will now show Marina's presentation. Okay, then let me start. I will start speaking about the platform that I'm going to present today. It has been in existence for 2 years. This is Aurora platform, and this is the platform that includes a multidisciplinary team, psychotherapists who work with trauma therapists who work directly with survivors, doctors, psychiatrists. Yes, let's go to the next slide. So doctors, gynecologists in particular, who can also help optimize reproductive health, lawyers, and case manager who helps responding to some additional needs. Our platform, it is free of charge, confidential, anonymous. We comply with high professional standards, ethical standards. Our specialists have supervision support, so we can rely not only on work with the team, but also on outsourced support. Aurora online platform was established by UNFPA with the assistance of the Office of the Deputy Prime Minister for European and Euro-Atlantic Integration of Ukraine and with the support of the government of the United Kingdom. Let's go to the next one. And let's try and discuss some definitions. In Ukraine, the issue of determining the status of the military and civilian prisoners still remains open. And so gaining the status as well as the status of sexual conflict in the context of sexual violence in the context of conflict, it is not yet clearly defined. If we speak about captivity, this is about restriction of freedom of a person who participated in military operations, which in order to prevent from further participation. Torture, any act that constitutes results in severe pain or suffering, physical or mental, intentionally inflicted on any person for the purpose of punishment, gaining confession, intimidation, coercion, And if we speak about the purpose of torture, this is about systemic destruction of an individual where physically the individual keeps living. And torture is one of the most severest forms of human suffering. Now, if we try to understand something about the experience of survivors, to understand what kind of material content we work with, we need to keep in mind that repeated traumas as a result of captivity and torture turn an individual into a victim and profoundly change their identity at the physiological, physical, social, and spiritual levels. People lose faith, prolonged stress, where people are deprived of the ability to satisfy basic needs for sleep, food, warmth, elementary comfort. This is about absence of the right to choose and about the inability to control one's life while in captivity. This is about total uncertainty. Traumatic experience is everything experienced by an individual during this period, along with the stress. This is a combination of physical, psychological, and other tortures, including sexual violence, which is used as weapons against humanity, and isolation, of course, including information isolation. All of that results in that the individual's identity is wiped out, understanding of him or herself, what happens to them. Now, speaking about consequences. These are the consequences that you may observe when documenting crimes. They may be physical in the form of bruises, scars, broken bones, or this may be the invisible consequences, but we need to keep those in mind as well. Various muscle pain, chronic pain, brain injuries, neurological damage, various diseases, sexually transmitted diseases, infertility, pregnancy as a result of rape, other somatic symptoms with which people, even after they survive the episode, they still live with that for years. Next slide. This is about psychological consequences, which are less noticeable, less visible, but they manifest themselves via the respective reactions of the survivors, especially in the process of interviews or in the process of documenting crimes. This may be acute stress reaction, various forms of shock reactions, symptoms of depression, anxiety, and that may be manifested in the situations where survivors refuse to be involved into the documenting process. PTSD, as we often mention, psychosis, cognitive issues, memory issues, attention disorders. And that's an important component that impacts documenting process, because when people may come with the first testimonies, they may not remember some of their experiences, because in this way, the brain, the mind represses those events, protecting the person from re-traumatization. And then gradually people go back to normal sleeping and gain the resources, and then by and by this story may become more comprehensive. We also observe quite a lot of suicidal tendencies, self-harm, and we often see that people after torture, especially with electric shock, they may cover their body with tattoos, where they cut themselves to at least somehow regain their perception of the body and to have this realization that the body is still alive. And all of these coping strategies result in that more and more often survivors may use psychoactive abuse, psychoactive substances, which affects their lives. Then social and spiritual consequences. In the social area, we observe withdrawal, self-isolation, fears, loneliness, mistrust, and that undermines our access to the survivors. Also, we see increasing rates of domestic violence, difficulties raising children because mom or dad who had the experience of captivity or torture, they have low capacity for meeting the kids' wishes or control their aggression, which may result in domestic violence. And we often see situations of breakup between spouses where they just cannot cope with all of those challenges. And spirituality, this is weakening of faith, doubts, separation from perception of the sense of value, loss of spiritual support. Next slide. Then what may be helpful in your work? What could contribute to the contact that would be more, that would be milder, so that it were really helpful, so that it helped our survivors to open up? This is about being attentive to boundaries. We speak about psychological, physical boundaries and time frames, because long interviews may result in exhaustion of survivors, and then they would avoid contributing to the process. And the main rule, as mentioned, is creating feeling of safety and security at all levels. Safe space, this is about requirements to the premises where you may be. It should be quiet without sharp smells or sounds. Safe interaction, where you are supposed to be as transparent and understandable as possible, discussing the goal, conveying the plan, the agenda, possible, and discussing possible diversions, discussing next steps, time and place. All of that needs to be predictable and understandable for the person who you're going to work with. A safe person next to the survivor, that's important. And that's about the person's voice and pace of speech, because we understand if we ask questions too fast or if they are unclear, then survivors may avoid those, not because they don't want to answer those questions, but because they may not understand them. Then explaining anything that is not clear, patience, attentiveness, and leaving space for choice, for making choice. That's also important, because your objective is to document crimes, but we also need to keep in mind that there should be also some agency of the survivor. Now, some don'ts, what one should avoid. This is when we tell people what you think they should have felt or thought, or how they should act, offering some advice. That reduces their self-confidence and blocks their possibility, their capacity to undertake next steps. Because the main objective of the healing process is to avoid creating lack of agency. It's important to support them on their way and to make sure that they will cope and they will heal. And definitely, one shouldn't say that everything will be fine, you will survive, you will cope with that. We need to avoid devaluing the experience like at least you have survived. That creates a lot of mistrust, and avoid making promises that cannot be fulfilled, where we say your perpetrators will be punished. We need to be as transparent as possible. We will do everything for the perpetrators to be punished, and for that sake, we need to document certain information. For that sake, we need to ask questions that may sound not that nice to you. Then we need to avoid criticizing available services, because we understand that avoidance is part of the trauma. When we say that a service is not good enough or experts are not good enough, we understand that we reinforce avoidance, and we need to avoid touching their body, hugging for reassurance, where it may feel like support to us, but to those people, it may be about violating their boundaries. And thank you.
Yael, you are muted. Yeah.
I would say the word comprehensive will mark all of these presentations. This is extraordinary, and we will also see, and unsurprising, but we will also see, of course, connections among the presentations. For example, when you describe a soldier or a person who had been in captivity coming home to the demands of home, or without transition.
Mm-hmm.
It's we have to be careful, really careful, and perhaps one result of this webinar will be to create a recommendation to ensure transition from one stage to another, because coming home for the demands of family and kids is very different than being under the gun and being almost a reflexive organism. You need to, okay, I'm not going to say more, because the dialogue will be later. Irina, my dear Irina, please take the floor.
Thank you so much, Yael, for...
Wait, before, let me interrupt you and me. Natalia and Anna, will there be a way to post the Ukrainian PowerPoints in English on our website? Marina, can this be arranged that we will, because on our website, it's both in Ukrainian and in English, but your PowerPoints are so important as an educational tool to, unfortunately, to so many other situations. So can we agree that somehow we will, within the week, we will arrange for the PowerPoints in English too? Is that all right, Marina? And or Anna? Okay, you're muted. Thank you for nodding your head. Irina, dear, your floor is yours indeed.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm going to, as you mentioned already, Yael, it's difficult to stick with one population. So in my presentation that meant to be dedicated to describe some peculiarities about listening to forcibly displaced witnesses, I would probably as well draw some examples from other populations. So I want to start from citing a very wise man, Professor Arik Shalev, who described all the common that war stresses has. And I do that because when we deal with witnesses, those people witnessed war crimes, and the toll and the burden of a number of potentially traumatic events is very high in this population. So those people faced inescapable life changes, many types of losses, both symbolic and real life losses, like losing safety, losing belongings, losing network or status, losing security, losing homeland, losing relatives, loved ones. And this is a very important topic. And of course, it's all about uncertainty, unpredictability, and unfortunately exposure to mass casualty scenes of death or destruction. But we should remember that not everybody who was exposed to those events is automatically receive a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. We should not pathologize, because people luckily naturally heal and recover as well. And I want to show you this drawing. Actually, Robin, I think it's from your webinar with, or maybe from other webinar about children and mental health during war, brought by my colleague from Kiev, Marina Gumenyuk. And this is a child's drawing, and you can see the house, and under the house, a multi-level basement to find a safe place. So it shows the despair and unsafety of a child seeking, for some piece of safety, at least in his or her fantasies. And this re-establishment of safety is very important, and Robin already spoke about that. And I think this is really important, how you communicate with the witness, either child or adult, and standardized procedures help to restore safety, because it gives the feeling of predictability, and managing expectations is crucial, but as well bringing back control and empowering is important. I wanted to show this picture as well because I must say that majority of forcibly displaced people from Ukraine are parents, and they bring their children to safer places. And of course, those become witnesses and might provide statement during the interview or collection of the evidence. So people dealing with those forcibly displaced witnesses who are parents at the same time should take care about the staff who may support children during the interview, if it's in person, or if it's online, they should provide in advance recommendation to find a safe place and still place, and of course still be prepared for interruption, because children will probably open the door, ask questions, and might interrupt the process. And I want to refer again to the website that Robin already mentioned, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network resources that were translated as well in Ukrainian, that became of real help for me when I was supporting parents of traumatized children, because it gives very clear and short information about how children of different ages might process trauma. And this is an excellent psychoeducational tool when you have a really small time next to a parent to support him during the interview, for example. I must say that forcibly displaced witnesses are more vulnerable than witnesses who stay in their own country or their own community. Because next to exposure to war atrocities, they experience displacement stressors like loss of status or poverty, unemployment, loss of possessions, discrimination, separation from their extended family members, uncertainty about the accommodation or work, and as well loss of social support. Definitely this will affect individual, and this of course will affect family and children. Therefore, it is really important to think about and prepare in advance the referral pathways and recommend on potential local support structures in a host community. And therefore, when we think about a witness and how he or she might be supported, for example, Marina just described that there is an Aurora platform in Ukraine that provides psychological support. But for forcibly displaced people, we should as well think about social support. We cannot neglect this. We should provide information if needed about medical services or social services, and especially that might provide support in the same language as the witness, because this is the major barrier for many of them to receive any support. And there are some cultural characteristics of help-seeking behavior of Ukrainians specifically. The problem is that witnesses from Ukraine, they do not prioritize mental health issues. And of course, compared to needs of children, witnesses will prioritize children's needs and not theirs. And I would say one of the problems is that we self-medicate. So instead of going and talking to somebody, we would look for medication that might help us. And this should be taken into account. The medical condition of a witness should be taken into account during the interview. And what kind of treatment they have or what kind of pills they have. We know in some cases they might abuse when they are anxious or worry or have to remember traumatic events, they might abuse with their medication. And yeah, this is an important issue. And Marina as well already mentioned about the continuous traumatic stress, and we are talking about the investigation during the ongoing conflict and recent New Year attacks on Ukraine exposed again people to feeling of helplessness and exhaustion and fear, and especially reactions like betrayal or rage might occur. So again, going back to safety, predictability, management of expectations, empowerment is really important, because unfortunately it's quite easy to re-expose people but unintentionally and evoke feelings of rage or betrayal by very simple things like not letting people in because of security issues, yeah, or not giving them a choice, or some other mistakes that Marina described during the communication inside. And as I mentioned, I think the most difficult feelings to bear during the interview by interviewers is when our witnesses talk about loss and feel grief. And I think that it's quite important to be aware about the basic helping skills presented in Problem Management Plus. This is the WHO manual for people without mental health education. We call them helpers or peer helpers on how to provide support. And as already mentioned, nonverbal communication and skills is very important. Praising openness is very important, as well as validating. So we can't just be silent if somebody shares something awful, especially about the loss of the close ones. So example of validation may be to say that, yeah, people that describe such events feel the same way as you, and it's normal. Communicating concern is important, like giving a feedback, like your experience is very difficult, or I can see how painful it was for you. Of course, putting aside personal values or not giving advice is the basic helping skills. And if you want to read more, I would share a link in the chat. And the last but not the least, As already mentioned, self-care is really important, but how would you know that you are okay listening to all those difficult stories? And I think, again, thanks to Professor Shalev, who formulated this very clearly, there is an idea or a concept of effective coping. And yeah, if we are sad or frightened, it's fine. But if we can regain control over our emotions, is the sign of effective coping. If we keep realistic self-image and we maintain positive feelings about self and others, it's really important. We can still have meaningful contacts with others. We are able to shift attention if we were not okay, and we can flexibly modify our decision based on new information. That is fine. And the opposite behavior, when we blame ourselves, when we have negative self-image, we self-criticize ourselves, when we overwhelmed with emotions and we over-engage and we rather disengage or stay lonely, this is an ineffective coping, and this might mean that you or I or we need a supervision or a peer support, etc. Thank you so much. Here is my email. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Irina. And you remind me that one of the webinars you can find on our website is specifically about refugee children. And it's a very rich international webinar that you might want to view if you want to add more dimensions to this discussion. We also have 2 webinars on torture that would also add dimensions to this discussion. David, you've been so patient. Well, the screen is yours. It's a total pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Yael, for the introduction, and again for allowing me to join you today. I'm trying to get things up here, and there we go. I'm really it's tough to go last because, as you've alluded to, Yael, and as others have mentioned, there's certainly overlap when we discuss quote unquote unique populations. And so I could shorten my presentation by just saying ditto to what everybody else said. But I will try to present a couple other bits of information that might help put some context around interviewing specifically military combatants or service members. And I would start with, Robin said at the beginning that children frighten people. Maybe soldiers frighten people too. But I think it's really important to remember that soldiers, like children, like other displaced refugees, like other potential survivors, are people like the rest of us. And really the same challenges apply. And if we keep that in mind, we'll be on the right track with regard to interviewing with the notion of reparative justice in mind. Soldiers are more similar than different. In terms of who I am, I'm as Yael mentioned at the beginning, I'm spent most of my career as a military psychiatrist, and my comments are really informed by combat and operational work that I've done. I've also done a lot of forensic work for the DoD, the Department of Defense, doing interviews of victims of trauma, as well as perpetrators of military sexual violence, and consulting with law enforcement services. I've worked at detention facilities like Fort Leavenworth in Kansas, which is a maximum security military detention facility. I've been to Guantanamo Bay in Cuba and Abu Ghraib. So I've seen the impact of traumatic experience, not only on survivors, but on those caring for survivors and on those who interview survivors in pursuit of justice. So I will echo some thoughts about the importance of self-care and self-awareness. I'm going to talk about some things that I've found helpful, and I hope will be helpful to others working with active duty members. But again, I think helpful across the global spectrum. And these are my thoughts and ideas. I don't have any other disclosures relevant to this or conflicts of interest. I work at the Department of Defense's Center for the Study of Traumatic Stress, where we study the context of trauma in disasters, terrorism, war. We do research, we do education and training with regard to the traumatic stress response from the cell to the individual to really to populations. And we've also helped develop and implement training for military medical officers to prepare them to interview survivors of military sexual trauma. So some of what I say will be related to specific training that we've helped to develop. I think a good place to really begin my comments is with a description, and you've heard some of this already, of how military leaders and service members are trained now to conceptualize the effects of trauma. And really, this is a reminder that, you know, although when we talk about psychological trauma and traumatic experience, we often talk about PTSD and other psychiatric disorders. But there are other outcomes of concern that we don't mention as often, and they're really at least as important because they can be more prevalent. Those would include distress reactions like insomnia or fear or worry, risky health behaviors like substance misuse, and others have commented on, in particularly the Ukrainian population, the potential for substance as a way to cope with trauma. And I think it's important as interviewers that we realize that whether or not somebody has a substance use disorder, alcohol use, for example, is associated with increased rates of work errors, accidents, difficulty concentrating, and accurately reporting events. So it doesn't matter if they have a disorder. We just have to be aware of the behaviors that are associated with traumatic experience. You know, it's good to remember that many who experience trauma will ultimately be okay. Those exposed, though, to man-made trauma, like torture, like rape, like other sexual assaults, they're at higher risk than those exposed to natural disasters. And unfortunately, those who are vicariously exposed, us as interviewers, are also at risk. So we really need to think about where we are on the continuum of stress response too. Another way of sort of saying the same thing is that the range of responses to stress can be sort of graphically described by this stress continuum, which is a model that the military uses in their combat and operational stress control framework. The continuum reminds us of several things. First, you know, that disasters and traumatic experience can cause a broad range of phenomena, not just PTSD, and that those phenomena can evolve over time as well. So proximity to the traumatic event may be playing a role in where somebody is in terms of their own response during the process of the interview and evidence gathering efforts. Second, the continuum reminds us that well-being and sustainment, they involve the actions of the individual, but also really the actions of peers, of the organization with whom they are associated, leaders, and really, again, for interviewers, we are part of the intervention process. And I think that was the point of Dr. Daniele's first webinar, that reparative justice includes the process of gathering information. And then lastly, on the sort of note of self-care, I think this continuum can serve as a barometer, a check as to where we are as interviewers. Where are we? Are we ready to go and ready to take on the next one? Are we in these sort of other levels of experience with regard to our own participation that might encourage us to practice different levels of self-care or, in fact, seek care? So I think the continuum is a helpful tool. I want to, because I think, you know, we've all sort of covered certain concepts in a as much as we can in 10 minutes way, I want to point out a couple of references that I think are helpful. First of these is this description of the Mendez principles. These are the principles that sort of form the foundation of effective interviewing. And this was Mendez was the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture who charged a committee to developed these principles and articulated them in a report, which is very available. If you go to www.interviewingprinciples.com, it's there on my slide. You can get sort of greater detail about all of these principles. But I want to point out a couple of things. First, that the principles that all of our presenters have shared are really based on a sort of a solid foundation, not only of research, but ethical and legal principles. That really what we're doing here is about complying with international law and with doing what is right as professionals. And there's science to inform that the sort of safety taking measures, the emotional space, the non-coercive, the open-ended question, all of this leads to more effective evidence gathering. And I think that that's really important. And then also the principles, they call for a need for training. So I put this is why we're here, to begin training. The principles point out not only the need for sort of initial orientation training, but ongoing training, that doing this right is a learning process. And we must evolve as interviewers too. And I think the notion that the interview is part of a larger process, that we have to keep this in mind. Our bit as interviewers is a piece of a larger puzzle. It's a team. It's an effort over time to put together a comprehensive picture, and keeping, the limits of our piece in mind help us from becoming too overwhelmed, too disillusioned, and distraught over our piece of the process. So I think those are important. With regard to training, there are resources also on the web. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security has a directorate for refugee, asylum, and immigration operations, and officers in that receive training. And there's a manual, and it's on the web, and it's lengthy. So there are some details, but I want to point out that there are chapters in that talk specifically about the range of emotional response that interviewees might experience. And also, there's a chapter really about that sort of puts into writing the steps that our presenters have given you today about things that we can do to mitigate the stress response during the interview, and therefore hopefully mitigate the amount of reporting error that we experience. And so I think, taking a look at references is important. And so that's why I put them up here. But, a training manual isn't the story, right? A training manual does not, it helps concretize things, solidify things, but there's much more to training than reading a manual. When our school trains medical students and student nurses to interview survivors of military sexual assault, the training involves first, of course, a review of other references to include instructional videos. But most importantly, it involves an interactive exercise with trained actors who are specifically guided on conveying the emotional and cognitive responses to traumatic experience, that allows our students to sort of experience themselves the challenges of an interview in a safe environment. And I think that, and it ends, of course, with a group debriefing where the students share with each other, what was hard for me, what worked, what didn't work. So pieces of this process that, in part of the continuing education model, they can help one another with, and also the universality of the challenges. I put this in here because our exercise, as I said, we end it with this small group discussions. And what in recent years we've added were therapy dogs. The dogs run around and they provide non-judgmental affection. Maybe they're not so good at respecting space, but they've been really universally enjoyed by participants, by the actors that participate in this exercise, and by the students. And I point that out only because again, my real point was that it's not all in the training manuals. Of course, you can't have dogs in interview situations where animals are part of the survivor's trauma experience. They would be triggers, but I'm just put these in to sort of encourage people to think creatively about what might provide the kind of environment that would be conducive to survivors sharing their experience. I want to summarize. Well, actually, even before I summarize, I want to mention a couple of things that are unique to the military. Perhaps unique to the military. Nothing that anybody has presented is truly unique to any small population. But I think it's important to realize that stigma regarding emotional response to, hey, I'm a soldier, I'm supposed to be tough, I can't be experiencing these things. That's going to impede reporting, and that's going to be a problem. The sense that many service members might have that, hey, others had it worse than I did, so why should I be having problems? That's going to be important and alter reports of self-experience. We have to think about in detained service members, the notion that some of them may become so disillusioned with their own government. How could my country, how could my government, how could my nation have allowed this to happen to me? And that disillusionment is going to color their reports, color their ability to accurately describe the experience they've had. And then with military members, some who are captured get captured because they desert or go AWOL. And we have to remember that persons who might have either been AWOL, considered going AWOL, they may color their own recounts of their experience with sort of excessive efforts at appearing patriotic or on track. So there are other reasons for distortion that I think we have to keep in mind. And then finally, and I guess this is related to the stigma thing too, military folks are always asking about the mission. Did I complete the mission successfully? Did I fail the mission? And perceptions of self-failure may also impede reporting, color reporting, and again, as our previous presenters have said, the importance of reassurance of non-judgmental questioning can help to alleviate and mitigate the extent to which reporting is altered by sort of a need to present mission completion or mission success. Now, I will try to conclude. To summarize, military and service members and leaders have increasingly become aware of the range of responses that we've all talked about today, that stress continuum model really recognizes the range of responses, and really, more importantly, I think can serve as a barometer for where we are in the process, and help guide our own care seeking. That the principles of the Mendez report and others are a good basis, a good stepping off point, but they're not the whole story. And interviewing is a evolving and requires creativity and sensitivity that can't be spelled out in training manuals. And certainly the particular challenges of stigma and trauma relativism, of mission completeness, and the need to appear to have been successful or feel successful are important to witnesses and military witnesses. And really, that's about all I wanted to say. I wanted to end with just a reminder of the principles of psychological first aid, because and these, for those who aren't familiar, are sort of the interventions that have been over time suggest to portend to the best outcomes in the aftermath of trauma. And so, they weren't written for interviewing witnesses or victims of trauma or torture, survivors, I should say, of trauma or torture. But I think keeping them in mind is really important. If you can convey a sense of hope, but not unrealistic hope, of safety, of presenting in a calm way, of and efficacy is another way of empowering. And then most important is connection. The most important factor in contributing to long-term health outcome after trauma is the ability to access and utilize social supports. And so establishing that connection is really critical. So just keep those things in mind as you engage in this process. And I think we'll all get better at it together. Thanks, Yael, and thanks for your patience with me.
No, this is wonderful. Eva, the training should adapt this last. Reparative justice should exactly adapt this last slide now. Well, I hope you're as humbled as I am by the quality of these presentations. There's so much to talk about, but we first are most honored to have with us, as I mentioned before, Veronica Klotnitkova. Please, the floor is yours to teach us more.
Thank you, Yael. I'm glad to be here with you on your screens and in your earphones. Especially, I'm glad to be here with our Ukrainians who are now abroad or in our Ukrainian cities. And if you don't mention, I will continue my speech in Ukrainian because we have a translation for it. Thanks.
Absolutely, we have a wonderful translation.
Отже, дякую всім.
So I would like to thank everyone, especially those who at present are in Ukraine. And actually, the time difference is so huge, but nevertheless, you paid attention to our webinar. And in my talk, I would like to discuss the following key issues which take place in the system of support of the victims and survivors of the war crimes. What's going on in the system of criminal justice and how the system of criminal justice is being implementing the human-centric and victim-centric approach. What is the coordination center of support of the witnesses and the victims? What are the methods of our work and how we can be useful, in which respects we can be useful to each other? Today, without, I'm not going to give the presentations the way my colleagues did, but I am ready to share any information on the issues which we are going to discuss. If we are talking about the statistics, so at present in Ukraine, more than 110,000 war crimes have been registered. And each war crime means dozens or even hundreds of the victims. And you can imagine the huge number of clients with whom the social services have to work and with whom the therapists have to work and the specialists have to work, the specialists who on the trauma issues. We understand that the first request is the request for the fairness, and it is very difficult to provide for it quickly on the national level and especially on the level of the international courts, which we are talking about. And thus, the individual might be in the situation when for years they will be waiting for the result of these hearings. Our colleagues have mentioned many times today that the individual who is the victim of the war crime feels absolutely unprotected because the state was not able to protect them, first of all. So our task is to demonstrate that no matter that we cannot protect ourselves completely from the full-fledged aggression, but we will do everything possible to protect our people now at this particular moment. And with this purpose, in the Office of the General Prosecutor and in the prosecution bodies, the coordination center of support of the witnesses and the victims have been created. We are engaged in the work with the victims. And why are we doing it and how we are doing it? Coordinators, and their main task is to be the managers of support for the victims during the criminal proceedings from the beginning to end. And first of all, they have to understand in the layman's language what's going to happen with these people during the criminal proceedings, and to interact with the prosecutors and the investigators as for the methodologies of interviewing and the questioning, which have to be applied to all the victims, and especially very vulnerable groups, those who are the victims of the sexual abuse and the torture, and the members of the families who have been killed as a result of the war crimes, the children, the people who became the people with disabilities as a result of the war crimes. And the third aspect is to provide the access to various services, starting from the primary psychological assistance and finishing with the legal aid, to be able to actually get the compensation, to get the legal aid and social services. As it was mentioned today, and all the speakers told about it, one of the problems and the issues of the victims is the lack of attention to their own mental health, and lack of attention to private needs, the impossibility to get information, or the psychological exhaustion, which does not allow them to take responsibility for their own life. At present, we are talking about the following. Our target group, and we are working not only with these victims who are in Ukraine at present, we start working with those victims who at present are outside Ukraine. And only in Poland, we have more than 1 million Ukrainians, and a lot of people have procedural status in our criminal proceedings. And one of the examples, I am not going to disclose the personal data, but I can describe the situation with this victim. This is a woman who at present is in Germany, and she was the witness about the shooting of her civil partner when they were evacuating from one of the occupied cities in Kyiv Oblast, in Kyiv region. She is one of the key witnesses in these proceedings, and we are working with her so that we can provide her with the psychological support, and this is being done online at present, to provide her with the opportunity to come back to Ukraine to participate in the investigation. And also we provide consultancy to her during the process, which is going to evolve. And we are going to explain what is in store for her. The center is working at present with the victims of the war crimes only, but in the future, for perspective, understanding that we are going to experience the decrease of criminality in various other areas, like home violence, for example, and maybe even the possibility of tortures of the national bodies, which we are going to increase our mandate, expand our mandate. In the chat, there was a question about the work with the victims of tortures outside the war area. I was one of the managers before I started to work for the coordination center. I was working in the department of the violation of human rights in the penitentiary system. So in this part, we also are going to take up the work, understanding that priority at present is given to the victims of the war crimes. But if we are talking about the general mandate of the center, and apart from providing access to the services, explaining in the layman's language what's going to happen during the proceedings, we also provide the psychological and physical stewardship, especially for the vulnerable groups of the victims during the investigations and during the questionings and the interrogations and hearing the cases in the courts. Now we are working on interaction with the International Criminal Court for those victims who in those parts of the proceedings which are going to be heard in the ICC. We also are working on creating the information network for our potential clients and for the victims who are outside of Ukraine at present, so they do not feel themselves abandoned by Ukraine, so that they would feel that they will be able to get assistance in other countries and they still have their roots in their own national state. The main message and the main mottos of our center, it was mentioned today, and it resonates with us. And this is one of the most important things for us. Well, don't promise, don't give the promises you cannot deliver on, and what could be not accessible to the victim. Do everything possible and which really meets real needs of the victim, and help the victim to get the fairness and equity, which is important for him or her at present. And we know, due to the communication with our clients and the colleagues, that sometimes for some people, it's most important to see the sentence and to see that the aggressor and perpetrator has been punished, even if this aggressor is not in the courtroom. For other people, it is important to get the status of the victim and to get the confirmation that all these awful things happened to this individual. And for some categories of the victims, it's an opportunity to get support, material support, and see that he or she has not been abandoned. And definitely, we have the standard operational procedures for various categories of victims, which deal with the psychological assistance issues and identification of needs and needs assessment. But the attitude to the victims, these soft skills which were discussed today, are used in each situation depending on the situation and on the individual. We understand that the work with the victims at present is our opportunity to support them in their life, to support them within the society, to help to avoid the secondary victimization, and to be able to create procedures and conditions so that the victims will not be traumatized by the criminal proceedings, so that the victims in the criminal procedures will not be treated as the source of evidence, so that they would not feel themselves the object, but they will feel themselves the the subject with the full rights, who is not a victim, but a survivor, as survivors. That's why that's an important part of our work.
Absolutely.
And respectively, for us, this is a story about a long-term story. We have the lawyers in our team and psychologists in our team and social workers. And because there are so many war crimes which have been carried out by the aggressors, and the huge number of the survivors and the victims, we cannot process all this by our center, but we are working with the representatives of the civil society, because they, from the beginning of the full-fledged aggression, and actually starting from the beginning of the war, which started in 2013, they, to a great extent, have organized the work with the survivors and the victims. And we are ready to work with the communities of the survivors who have to have all the full rights of the processes in which they participate and which deal with them. Because there is one more task for us. We have to demonstrate that nobody can take decisions for the victims, and nobody has the right to actually to decide what to do with the perpetrators. So this is an important part of our work. If we are talking about the approaches which are to be implemented in terms of material aspect, the work of the center is going to start officially from the 18th of January, and all the requirements about the safe places and the special dedicated premises are going to be met. It's going to be a special premises to communicate with the survivors and the coordinators, a special place to work with the psychologists, and a separate space for the children, a special space for the interviews and the interrogations with the prosecutors, in accordance with all the requirements which we were discussed, so that people will feel safe to the extent it is possible in Ukraine at all at present. And thus, this is an opportunity also to engage as many colleagues and the partners from the non-public sector, and also to unite the efforts of the subjects of the public sector, so that any kind of assistance will be available. I will be happy to maintain contacts with all of you after the end of this webinar, because it's a long-term work, and I am so happy that the participants are so highly professional and so much engaged today. And I would like also to add another comment and addition. When we are talking about the work with the survivors, and when we are talking about the work of the criminal justice, it is very important to talk about the resilience of the prosecutors and the investigators who are working with the victims, so that they would not burn out, and so that they would not cause the repeated trauma, and do not get vicary traumas. And that's why in the prosecution office, we launched a project to support the resilience of the prosecutors who are working with the war crimes, those who are working in the regions of Ukraine, who are working in Kherson region and Kharkiv Oblast, which are on the front line at present. So we always are happy to engage professionals in our work. Thank you, and I hope I will be able to answer your questions.
Veronica, I didn't realize how timely this webinar is. So, near the birth of the center in January 18. And let me share with you that we have already discussed and agreed to be there for you as resources, for training, for support, literally everything you need. So absolutely. I met the general prosecutor here in New York, and it's such a pleasure to meet you. So, so each one of our panelists has already said yes to being there to help. And thank you for your work. It's huge. So we are here. There's so much to say. I kept jotting down more questions and more things, and of course we will continue. And this is the phase of dialogue among the panelists before the question and answer period with the audience. I'm wondering, you're all invited to unmute, and please, if you have any questions to each other, any comments on each other's presentations, besides just being amazingly wonderful. So please. the question from the audience will follow this phase of our webinar. Irina, please, dear.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate presentation of each panelist. And the final presentation, when you, Veronica, said that this center exists and how much is already prepared and you are starting, it's great news. It's really nice to hear that. I think it's a huge step ahead. I have a question to Eva, because like we already discussed among our panelists, we have majority of mental health professionals and only 2 lawyers. So my question to you, Eva, how was this for you? Maybe you have some important reflection or feedback for us. Because we were speaking from the perspective of mental health professionals. How lawyers do hear us?
Thank you, Irina, for this question.
It's a very small question. Yeah.
Yes, I know. I remember that once Kiel said that I'm not a usual lawyer. Remember that, year? What I can say, I think that, the modern justice system cannot avoid personal sources of evidence. And consequently, when we are seeking to justice to victims of armed conflict, there is unfortunately a price to be paid by these individuals. Looking at the administration of justice from the point of view of victims or survivors, in some legal systems, witnesses to crimes are obliged to testify before a prosecutor or later before a court. In other legal systems, this is done on a voluntary basis. However, unregulated it may be, when it comes to witnesses dealing with the trauma of the personal experience they have had in relation to the armed conflict, a regulation implying an obligation to testify will not work. For this reason, especially when it comes to witness of international crimes, which are the most heinous crimes, it must be accepted that the questioning of witnesses must respect the principle of voluntary participation and the principle of first and foremost, do no harm. For this reason, it's so important to limit the number of hearings with the same witness in order to avoid or at least limit the deepening of the trauma experienced by that person. And I think that, unfortunately, it's not common, I would say. And I'm unfortunately see this, and I'm sorry for that, because I know how that from one hand, legal system needs all these people, all these witnesses, very much traumatized. And on the other hand, everything must be done based on their voluntary testimonies. We cannot force them to testify. We know that they can share so many information, so much relevant actually information, but we cannot force them, right? That's why it's important to, to, as also David said, to make a proper environment, right? To encourage them to say something. And lawyers just need to listen to them in a proper way. Also, David said that about that, and I'm absolutely grateful for you were saying, David. So I think it's very much needed, and it's so important to have this knowledge about the trauma, how it works. And I'm absolutely grateful for this webinar.
Thank you, Robin. You seemed, you had words coming out of your face. Go ahead.
No, I agree. I will echo what you've said. There has been a lot said that overlaps all the different populations. And the 5 principles that David had listed come from work from Stephen Hopful, and really
Yes.
has been cornerstone for so many populations, so many different types of issues. So I think I applaud you to think about taking those 5 principles and embedding them into the ICM-GLT, because
Exactly.
it really does work well. And I do appreciate that all the speakers did talk about not promising things you can't deliver. And I will say that is very, very hard when you're working with children, because adults want to promise them that everything will be okay. I mean, I know they want to do that with adults. They want to do that with adults as well. I recognize that, but there's something about wanting to protect the youngest that we tend to offer platitudes and make promises, and they've already had their trust ripped away from them. And so if the very people that are supposed to be helping them repair that make promises that can't be kept, you're setting up for adulthood of lack of trust. So I really do appreciate everyone talking about don't overcommit to something that we don't know. But we can, I do think, and I'll be quiet after this, I do agree, I can't remember who said it, that we have to keep in mind that even people that have been exposed to the most unimaginable, most people will do well. And we often think, well, if people are resilient, we don't need to do anything. And the reality is we are resilient because of what we do. And the big number one is that connectedness. And if we can at least begin there, however we enter the discussion, the process, if we recognize that that connectedness is going to be the most valuable thing we do, we can build from there. And I'm going to be quiet.
Thank you. This is extremely helpful, because we're talking really about being fully present for the person in the story. And that is part of why we must have the training, because part of what one does, not necessarily consciously, without the training for awareness, is believing that you're fully there, but you're really not. And if I might take a moment, forgive me, I'm abusing my
Prerogative.
my moderation.
Yeah, sure.
But really, this is research. And Irina, would you help me putting it up, please? Or Robbie, please put up what I wanted to. This is a result of research I have done many years ago that actually led me to what to the field, because part of what I was hearing from all survivors is that nobody would listen to us and nobody would understand unless they went through the same experience. So I was an idealistic graduate student at the time, and I said, my God, I must change my dissertation to study how come people who are supposed to listen do not listen. So I want just 3 slides to share with you. Please go to the next. And I studied, no, go back for 1 second. So I studied and found the elements of the conspiracy of silence, or what my colleague Jack Lindy called failed empathy after trauma. And here are the themes. I found 49 ways to not listen to people. And this is from graduate people with degrees and with full training. So let's go to the next. And my thinking was this, where a society has a moral obligation to share its members' pain, psychotherapists and researchers of all related professions, including lawyers, of course, have in addition a professional contractual obligation, right? When we fail to listen, explore, understand, and help, we inflict what Reparative, who is a survivor of the Holocaust, called the trauma after the trauma, or quotes the second injury to victims that Simmons wrote about, by maintaining and perpetuating the conspiracy of silence. And I will show you, go to next, okay, just very quickly, the map of silence. Okay, now we will have a special webinar on this. Okay, so not to worry. I just wanted to give you the sense of here we are, brilliant people in our fields, but we too sometimes fail to hear, okay, because we have our own history, as Robin stated, and we have our own needs to defend against evil. So just take a quick look very quickly in order of frequency. That means 1 is the most frequent. Some of the major categories of, I called it countertransference phenomena. I will explain that in the training. So 1, the most frequent were various modes of defense against listening to Holocaust experience. But it was done with others, and against therapists' inability to contain their emotional reactions. So it's not only what you do, it's because you're unable to take it in. It's too much, right? The emotion. So, for example, numbing, denial, avoidance, distancing, clinging to professional role, right? I'm the lawyer, you're the client. Or I'm the doctor, you're the patient. A reduction to method or theory. Let me give you a very quick example. In my work in Bosnia, we worked all over the country for quite a long time. And when we went together to Germany, where many refugees were finding a place of safety, but the hearing by the doctors were done in a military hospital, and they were all wearing their white coats, and they scared the hell out of the refugees. So all I asked was, do it elsewhere, just not in the military, under military, and not in a white coat. It was so simple. You mentioned the comfort of dogs. I cannot have a dog. because many of my patients were exposed to dogs, finding them in hiding and disclosing disclosing them. So even when we say something so lovely like a dog, we have to be so context trauma informed, as Robin mentioned, right? We really have. So part of what we need to do is really learn a lot. We have to learn a lot, not just to rely on the victims to tell us. Study the situation so you can open your mind to the possibilities. And of course, we had a lot of affective reactions. Irina mentioned it in her presentations, such as bystander's guilt. We will have a special webinar on that. Bystander's guilt, rage. The therapist can be enraged at the story. That's very important. It's allowed, but not at the patient. Okay, so that's where the training comes in, to identify, but to know how to contain it, what to do. And again, dread and horror, shame, disgust, grief, mourning, so important. We will have a special webinar on that. The Me Too, right? The best way to shut somebody up is to say, I totally understand you. Think about it. If you totally understand, the person doesn't have to speak anymore. There's so much to learn in depth, and of course the sense of bond, which is again totally understandable. But in the study, we discovered that can have problems too, and to feel privileged, like I'm privileged to this horror. So then you ask too many questions when the person doesn't need intuition, for example. There's so much to learn. And of course, specific relational context issue, such as how do you feel about parents? How do you feel about children in relation to parents? Or what I call victim liberator, viewing the survivor as hero. So if the survivor is a hero, you don't think of them as vulnerable. It's a problem, etc., etc. So there is, thank you, you can close that. I wanted to share that because I think we should share all of that as possibilities for not only self-healing, but being compassionate to ourselves. We're not perfect. We are very well trained. We are not perfect. I think, Irina, did you put in my principles of self-help in the chat? It's also on our website. But so I wanted to make sure, Veronica, before the opening, that you know that we know that. Marina, I was wondering what are your experiences of the panel? What would you like to add? And please unmute. And David, I know you'd be next. Yes.
What I want to add now, it's the same that we talk from day to day. For us, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. It's a very long distance way for our victory and for the justice to all survivors and victims. So we will need all possible support and commitment in this process. And thank you from time to time for all of you done for us.
We're not finished yet. The audience has some stuff to say. Wait. Marina, do you want to add anything? I know it's been
I would like to add that this a very important topic. The topic when we can discuss the experience with the specialists of various levels and high level, and we can interact, because quite often the survivors are saying that we are actually traumatized several times when this incident took place, and then during the interviews when the specialists might be not very educated and not very well prepared. And I am very grateful to Veronica for the pool of the trained specialists. And this gives us hope, because not only the strong systems can actually help people to recover and help to heal. Thank you.
Yes. David, please, unmute.
Thank you. Again, my thanks to all the presenters. I've learned from everyone, and I think the important thing is that we do continue to learn together. I believe as prosecutors, your commitment to ultimate victory is noble. There will be defeats along the way and frustrations, and I think if we work together, we can. And it was alluded to by many that we can at least help temper the potential for burnout and disillusionment amongst those you noble champions, and we want to be there to help you. So my contact information is available. I've worked with defense teams and prosecutors in these struggles, and there's a tremendous pressure on you to succeed. And I want to be available to help. So I just close with that.
Wonderful. We have some comments and some questions. Larry Holman from the audience. Larry Holman asked two questions. Have Americans been traumatized by the January 6, 21 insurrection against our national capital containing the Congress of the United States? How can they be restored to good mental health? And he asks another question, is revenge and retaliation important to achieving a sense of justice? I think these are two separate webinars. Larry, yes, Americans have been traumatized, depending who in particular. It's been politicized in ways that make it very difficult to decipher all the ways. I'm sure that the other two Americans here, Robin and David, you might want to say something, and particularly if revenge and retaliation are important to achieving a sense of justice. Go ahead, David, you had your hand up. But
Sure. I was just going to say that the experience of, it's hard, just as with any trauma, it's impossible to say we've all been affected the same way. The events of January 6th have affected all of us. Whether traumatized or not is the right term depends, I think. So I think it's always dangerous to generalize. So that would be my best response to a tricky question there. With regard to retaliation and revenge, I'd like to hear what Yael has to say about sort of the concept of repairing and reparative justice. I think they're a little bit anathema to that. If really what our involvement is supposed to be is healing, I'm not sure that there's a role for revenge or retaliation, or I think that's a distraction from what we're trying to achieve. But I'd certainly be welcome to hear what others say.
It's a huge topic, and let's not make it a simplistic one. Revenge means I will do to you what you did to me. So that means a victim turned perpetrator. There are, and this belongs to a whole world of identity pathologies. in a lot of the presentation, the one thing I missed was the issue of identity. That the traumas we are talking about can, in fact, and this is my whole theory, right, create identities, not just symptoms. They can shift the person's way of being in the world, the person's way of relating to people, the person's way of thinking, of believing, of respecting or disrespecting, etc. And in my writings and in my studies, I showed, different ways of adapting these kind of what I call adaptational styles or identities. So one of the things survivors say that revenge it might make you feel better at that second, but then you feel terrible. Because the justice you arrived at is not out of the trauma, it's actually in the trauma. So it's a question whether it's justice really. But let's have a separate, let's plan to have a webinar on that. And I'm sure lawyers will have a lot to say about revenge and justice. So let's do that. Edna, thank you for asking, reminding Robin to talk about abducted children.
Definitely wanting to go there. I hear that.
We're all very involved in it. Absolutely.
I think that is
emotionally as well as literally as well as day to day right now.
Yes, I think that is happening, and this is an issue in so many conflicts. As Edna mentioned, we have ongoing hostages, including children that have been abducted in the Israeli-Hamas war. It is, I wish I could say, here's the roadmap for abducted children, but we don't have a roadmap. What we know is that for children or for adults as well who have been abducted, there is something that is happening during their taking that can create obviously trauma, and they may handle it in many, many different ways. But then as they're returned, yes, everybody's happy, but that return to freedom is not as easy as, okay, now we're back, everything can go forward. Because for children in particular, there are those trauma responses that often come. What happened to my world? That those feelings of shock and numbness and anxieties and fears are, well, it's true for adults too. I won't say it's just children, but you also may see withdrawal. Even though they're back to people that they cared about, that relationship is different. And so there may be some withdrawal or some guilt over what I did or didn't do to have that happen. And so I think we see that. I think, we have heard that idea of in many instances of Stockholm syndrome, that maybe I begin to identify with the people that took me. Other times there's a new, it's not so new, but it's really being looked at again from Sweden, a resignation syndrome of particularly for children, where they just absolutely withdraw because they feel a complete sense of abandonment and helplessness, that there's nothing I can do. I think both of those are going to take some extra training and some extra awareness, again, from a trauma-informed look. How do we relate to children? And it gets back to that safe, secure environment in which they are returning to. How do we create that for them? And that's everything from when they are giving witness or offering testimony to offering them different ways to express themselves, whether it's through writing, whether it's through art, whether it's through music. There are so many things that abduction is just the first beginning, right? Yeah, it's that beginning. And that's a brand new chapter that's written into that child or adult's history. And now it's what happened during that abduction. But to assume that just because they're released, everything is happy, happy, joy, joy, it is very unrealistic. And if we are expecting smiles from children, look, here's games and presents and things, I think we're missing the boat of what they really need. And so it's a complex issue. And unfortunately, for many in Ukraine, many of those children, that's what's happened. It's happened there. It's happening in Gaza. It's happening with children who were separated at the southern border in the United States and kept in locked cages. To me, that's the similar kinds of things. So how do we do that? I wish there were here's how we do it, but I think I would love that to be a topic of one of your webinars.
We will have,
How do we best support abducted individuals and hostages?
Exactly, because we have abducted elderly people and women who are being raped during the abduction, and children who are with their parents or someone they know, and children who are split from that or lost their parents.
Absolutely.
But yeah, all we are learning today is that we have so much more to learn, which is exactly the right kind of attitude to learning. Because Jackie, your comments are so well taken. Jackie reminded us in the chat that you know about the suicide as one of the consequences in the military and otherwise. Maybe we should talk about that too in the future. I did not ask Anna in my usual fashion to translate to us the questions in the chat, but there is
I can help with that, Yael, if you want. I just can summarize the questions in Ukraine.
I'm afraid we have 3 more minutes. So if you can sort of put it together, but in a way, would you please put it together as a suggestion for future webinars rather than as a question for now? Because I think each one of these questions really deserves a webinar. And this is a series that we are doing. So it's not the last time we are discussing it by any means. So go ahead. Is it Anna or Natalia?
Can you allow me to do that so I can summarize those?
Please, Irina, you do that.
Yeah, I think the majority of questions were addressed by speakers, by Veronica or Marina. There was a set of questions, and I would support this topic very much, is like when we question children, so when the children are in the process of interview, is it acceptable to use specially trained psychologists to interview a child? Or what what is the training for investigators to run an interview with traumatized child? And from myself, I would add as well, how would you address the issue of children with disability, including physical disability and cognitive disability? And Robin just mentioned briefly that it definitely affects the way how the child process the trauma. And I think one of the important questions was how would you use art? And I think with those children, this is one of the limited options that you can basically use. So I think that's the summary.
Yeah, you can see in Israel now when the hostage children were, some of them were returned, the hospitals arranged for them to feel at home in very particular ways. That included art, that included their pets. There's a lot more to learn. Dina Djukovic, who is a member of our board, is mentioning that Croatia had a special conglomerate of ways to help support victims in giving testimony. Dean, would you please send it to us for the website? Let me just share with you right now that we will conduct our next webinar in this series. Will be at the beginning of February when we figure out how many people are available at the same day, probably the first or second Monday. Before that, we do have a webinar planned by our working group on nuclear issues, on humanity's generations in nuclear times. That will take place on 25 January at 6 o'clock, and you will all receive the flyer immediately after this webinar. But be prepared to join us again in this series, either the first or second Monday of February. And we continue the best way to very carefully, very thoughtfully, and respectfully of the kind of sacred work we're talking about, really. So we continue. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yael. Thank you.
Thank you, and God bless
Have a
you.
safe evening.
Thank you so
До
much.
побачення.
And Veronica,
Дякуємо.
at some point, we might want to perhaps organize a conference in Kyiv. You know, and I think that would, you know, that would be, and speak to all the local resources, right? Absolutely, we are with you. Okay, guys, everybody take good care, and until next time.
Bye-bye.
Hey.